You stand in a corridor lit only by oil lamps, their flames casting shadows that dance like gin across marble walls. The air tastes of rosewater and fear. Behind the carved cedar door ahead, a ceremony is unfolding that will be erased from every official chronicle, buried by scribes who understand that some truths are too dangerous to preserve. Tonight, 5 laws older than empires will shatter, and the woman at the center of it all, a girl stolen from her father's house at 15, sold in a slave market, renamed and remade, will become more powerful than any man dares to acknowledge. Before we go deeper, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. It genuinely amazes me that a secret buried in 1534 can reach screens across the entire world today. The year was 1534. The place, Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, capital of an empire that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the shores of Yemen. And the event that night would not appear in any Ottoman court register, any imam's record, or any ambassador's dispatch. Because what Suleiman the Magnificent was about to do violated every sacred principle that had held his dynasty together since 1326. He was marrying a slave. Not just any slave, but a Ukrainian girl captured by Tatar raiders, sold in the markets of Kaffa, and delivered into the imperial harem as property. Her name at birth was Alexandra Lisovska. The Ottomans called her Hurrem, the joyful one. But there was nothing joyful about the revolution she had engineered in silence, year by year, child by child, whisper by whisper. To understand why this wedding was an act of quiet insurrection, you must first understand the 5 iron laws that governed the Ottoman dynasty. The first, 1 concubine, 1 son. Once a woman bore a prince, she was never again summoned to the sultan's bed. This rule existed to prevent any single mother from accumulating dynastic power, to keep the harem balanced, fractured, safe. The second law, no sultan could marry a slave. Imperial marriages were reserved for foreign princesses, tools of diplomacy, bonds between kingdoms. The third, no woman of the harem could reside in Topkapi itself, the seat of government. Women were kept in the old palace, miles away, their voices muffled by distance from the machinery of rule. The fourth, ranks within the harem were rigid, fixed by centuries of precedent. No new titles could be invented, no woman could rise beyond the station assigned to her. And the fifth law, perhaps the most absolute of all, women were barred from councils of war, diplomacy, and statecraft. Their sphere was reproduction and ornament. Nothing more. Hurrem broke every single one. Her story begins not in palaces, but in fire and screaming. In 1520, Tatar horsemen swept through the town of Rohatin in what is now western Ukraine. Alexandra, daughter of an Orthodox priest, was 15 years old. Later accounts describe her as slender, with pale skin and red gold hair that caught light like flame, a rarity that would triple her value in the slave markets. But it wasn't just beauty that set her apart. Merchants who inspected her noted something else: intelligence in her eyes, composure under terror, the kind of adaptability that meant survival. She was purchased by agents of the Ottoman court and sent as a gift to Hurrem Sultan, mother of the newly crowned Suleiman. Inside the harem, Alexandra was stripped of her name, her faith, her past. She learned Ottoman Turkish, Persian, the basics of Arabic. She studied Quran, courtly etiquette, music, dance, poetry, and she mastered something far more dangerous: the psychology of power. How to read a man's desires before he named them, how to become indispensable not just in bed, but in the silent hours after, when empires are actually shaped. Suleiman was 26 when he ascended the throne in 1520, a poet-warrior educated in philosophy and scripture, tall and aquiline, with eyes that European envoys described as penetrating. He had inherited the richest empire on earth. And in 1521, when his gaze first fell on the red-haired girl newly renamed Hurrem, Neither of them could have imagined that their union would redraw the constitutional order of 3 continents. She bore him a son in 1521, Mehmed. By Ottoman law, that should have been the end. 1 concubine, 1 son. She should have been sent away, her chapter closed, but the following year she gave birth again. A daughter, Mihrimah, then another son, Selim, in 1524, then Bayezid in 1525, then Cihangir. Each birth was a violation of the empire's most sacred rule, and each tightened her grip on Suleiman's lineage. There was already an heir, Mustafa, born to another concubine, Mahidevran. But Mustafa was sent to govern a distant province, his path to the throne quietly obstructed while Hurrem filled the palace with her own children. Whispers turned to alarm. Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, Suleiman's closest friend since childhood, saw the danger. In letters preserved in Venetian archives, he warned that this woman threatened the balance of the dynasty itself. But Hurrem was always one move ahead. She didn't just seduce Suleiman's body, she infiltrated his mind. In his most private hours, she became his confidant, his advisor, his mirror. Foreign ambassadors began to notice. Bernardo Navaggero, the Venetian envoy, wrote in 1530, "This woman of barbarian origin wields more influence over his imperial majesty than any counselor. No decision is made without her." But influence from the shadows was not enough. Hurrem wanted permanence. She wanted legitimacy, and for that she needed to marry the Sultan. It was unthinkable. No Ottoman ruler had married a concubine in over 200 years. Marriage was a political tool, reserved for alliances with foreign courts. To marry a former slave would humiliate the dynasty, degrade the throne, invite chaos. Yet Hurrem set the board with terrifying patience. First, she removed her greatest obstacle. Hafsa Sultan, Suleiman's mother, was the only woman in the empire powerful enough to block her. In 1534, Hafsa died suddenly. Official records blamed illness, but palace physicians later noted symptoms consistent with slow poisoning. Arsenic, tasteless and untraceable, slipped into food over months until the body surrendered. With Hafsa gone, Hurrem turned her attention to Ibrahim Pasha. She launched a whisper campaign, planting doubts about his loyalty, his ambition, his secret dealings with foreign powers. Suleiman, once unshakable in his trust, began to waver. And then, in the winter of 1533, the preparations began. They were conducted in absolute secrecy. No official chronicler recorded them, but fragments survive in diplomatic letters, in the memoirs of eunuchs, in the invoices of jewelers and perfumers. Byzantine craftsmen were summoned to create a bridal crown. Arab merchants delivered silks dyed in colors reserved for royalty. The ceremony would fuse Islamic ritual with Byzantine imperial pomp, a symbolic declaration that the old rules no longer applied. There was one legal obstacle. Ottoman law forbade a sultan from marrying a slave. So Hurrem was freed, officially by imperial decree, on the morning of the wedding. Technically, she entered the ceremony as a free woman, but everyone understood the truth. This was a slave being crowned empress. The wedding night itself has been deliberately obscured by history. The exact date was erased from palace records. No eyewitness account survived intact. But we know this. The ceremony took place inside Topkapi, in chambers decorated with opulence surpassing even coronations. Suleiman, dressed in robes embroidered with verses from the Quran, stood before imams who had been persuaded, or pressured, to bless a union that violated centuries of precedent. And Hurrem, no longer Alexandra, no longer a concubine, walked through those doors as Haseki Sultan, a title that had never existed before that night. Haseki, the sole favorite. The word came from Persian, but its application was revolutionary. By adding sultan to it, a term reserved for male rulers, Hurrem claimed authority equal to any crowned empress in Europe. Scholars had twisted themselves into intellectual knots to justify it, citing obscure hadith and reinterpreting classical texts. The documents survive in the palace library, and they are painful to read, full of strained logic and theological gymnastics. Because everyone knew what this really was, a constitutional coup disguised as romance. But the wedding was only the beginning. Hurrem's third violation came swiftly. In 1534, a fire was reported at the old palace where women of the harem traditionally lived. Conveniently, the damage was just severe enough to justify relocating Hurrem to Topkapi itself, the seat of government, the beating heart of imperial power. Later investigations found no evidence of serious structural harm. The fire, most historians now believe, was staged, an excuse to break the third sacred law and install Hurrem where no woman had ever been permitted to dwell. From her new chambers, Hurrem gained something unprecedented: access. Architects constructed hidden passages linking her rooms to Suleiman's. Specially designed windows allowed her to observe meetings of the imperial council from behind latticed screens. Secret listening devices, primitive but effective, carried whispers through the walls. Ministers debated policy, unaware that every word was being heard by the sultana, analyzed, recorded, weaponized. She built an intelligence network that rivaled the empire's own spy apparatus. Eunuchs, hand-picked concubines, bribed servants, all fed her information. No intrigue escaped her notice. No conspiracy went undetected. Armed with this knowledge, she whispered strategies to Suleiman that shaped the fate of nations. French envoy Antoine Escalin des Aymars wrote in 1541, "He who seeks favor from the Grand Turk must first secure the goodwill of his sultana, for no decision is made without her." And then came her most ruthless act: the elimination of Mustafa. Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son, was everything an Ottoman heir should be: brave, intelligent, beloved by the Janissaries. He was the presumed successor, and he was Hurrem's greatest threat, because if Mustafa became sultan, Hurrem's own sons would be executed, standard Ottoman practice to prevent civil war, so she set out to destroy him. For years, she planted seeds of doubt. Through her network of spies, she forged letters suggesting Mustafa was conspiring with the Safavid Empire, Suleiman's greatest enemy. The documents were flawless, bearing Mustafa's own seal, stolen through bribes from his secretaries. In 1553, during a military campaign in Persia, Suleiman summoned his son to his tent. Mustafa came willingly, trusting the ancient guarantee of safety granted to princes during family audiences. Behind the silk curtains, mute executioners waited. They seized him with bowstrings, strangling the breath from his lungs while Suleiman stood motionless, watching his firstborn die. The empire convulsed. Janissaries revolted. Chroniclers recorded uprisings that had to be crushed with brutal force. European courts recalibrated their strategies, sensing Ottoman weakness. Charles V, Ferdinand of Austria, Francis III, all saw opportunity in the chaos. But Hurrem's revolution had already taken root too deeply to be torn out. Her marriage had set a precedent that shattered dynastic tradition. Future sultans would marry slave concubines regularly, abandoning alliances with foreign princesses. Power shifted inward, concentrated within the palace walls. Her residence in Topkapi became permanent policy. Later, sultanas would wield authority from those same hidden chambers. The title Haseki Sultan, invented for her, was claimed by successors, Nurbanu, Safiye, Kosem, each building on the foundation Hurrem had laid, and her direct participation in governance. That became the norm. Historians call it the Sultanate of Women, a period lasting nearly 2 centuries when mothers, wives, and sisters of sultans wielded open or covert power over imperial decisions. Hurrem Sultan would eventually command the execution of sultans, the appointment of grand viziers, the direction of military campaigns. She ruled an empire in all but name. Foreign courts adapted. Ambassadors began bringing gifts specifically for the sultanas, acknowledging them as essential players in Ottoman politics. Queens across Europe watched with a mixture of horror and envy, some quietly experimenting with similar tactics within their own spheres. Hurrem died in April 1558, 8 years before Suleiman. She was laid to rest in a mausoleum beside the mosque she had endowed, her tomb inscribed in 3 languages, Arabic, Persian, Ottoman Turkish, praising her achievements in terms unimaginable for a slave girl just decades earlier. Suleiman, shattered by her loss, decreed that no other woman would ever inhabit her chambers in Topkapi. That order held until the empire's dissolution in 1922. Her architectural legacy still stands in Istanbul and Jerusalem. Mosques, schools, hospitals, public kitchens, each one a monument not just to piety, but to female power, announcing that her authority was permanent, carved into stone and law. The question lingers, though, debated by historians even now. Did Hurrem liberate Ottoman women, or only herself? The answer is layered. Her victories were selfish, ruthless, stained with blood. Mustafa's execution, Mahidevran's humiliation, the fracturing of dynastic stability. But the doors she broke open could never again be sealed. She left future women of the dynasty opportunities they would never have dreamed of under the old order. 5 laws shattered on one wedding night. 5 pillars of a new political reality that endured for generations. A teenage girl stolen from her father's house in Ukraine became the architect of an empire's transformation, proving that even in the most rigid systems, one woman's intelligence, patience, and audacity could remake the world. Suleiman the Magnificent conquered continents, built monuments, commanded armies that made Europe tremble. But history remembers him now as much for the woman who stood behind him, or beside him, as for the battles he won. Because in the end, the greatest conquest was not won with swords or treaties. It was won in the hidden chambers of Topkapi, in whispers and careful calculation, in the quiet revolution of a woman who refused to remain invisible. And long after the empire crumbled, after the palaces fell silent and the sultans faded into memory, one truth remained. On that erased night in 1534, when oil lamps flickered and forbidden vows were spoken, the course of history bent, not with the roar of cannon, but with the rustle of silk and the breaking of chains no one had believed could ever be broken.